Oh, 1, 2, oh, 1, 2. Is there sound coming through? Is there sound coming through this microphone? All right, let's get down to business then, shall we? Okay, everybody, thank you. If you're joining me for the first time, it isn't always like this. It is sometimes like this, and for that, I sincerely apologize. But if you're tuning into this video, you are here to get into it with us on the discussion of why do bad things happen to good people. I don't know if I'm going to give you the final answer on that as far as you're concerned, but I can give some Jewish perspectives on this idea. And so thank you everybody for playing along. Sometimes we have some technical difficulties here in the Jew Curious show and our live studio recordings. That is the risk and the reward of tuning in live. The risk is sometimes we have bloopers. The reward is you're kind of in the know and just to see the kind of shenanigans that we get up to that get edited out of the podcast. So you get to see the live material that we then later, God willing, edit into a podcast episode of the Jew Curious show. And sometimes that means sitting around being bored because the microphone's broken. So in any case, I'm always expressing my gratitude to this community. Today, it is for your patience. So without further ado, in just a moment, we are going to get into the topic at hand, which is why do bad things happen to good people? Conversely, why do good things happen to bad people? And what are some different Jewish perspectives on that? Because it's Judaism, there are different perspectives on that. So just wanted to give a high five to all the people who came early and have been hanging out. Let's see. We've got Susan and Karen and Daniel are here. Daniel's from Fort Worth, Texas, says, Rabbi, you're always supposed to know it all and have infinite backups of superhero gear. I wish that were true. There's no Rab cave, as the case may be, that I, pull on a secret phone and go down a little pole and then there's infinite backups of working microphones. One of these days, maybe in Olam Haba, all rabbis will have a bat cave with fully functioning audiovisual gear. Perhaps it's something to look forward to. We got Karen, we got Jessica here. Ruthie is in the house, and we are ready to go. So in just a second, we are good. Karen said, just take it back. So Drake's in the house. Welcome back, Drake. Karen says, this is so fun and real. So it is that. It is real. If nothing else, this is real life, y'all. So let's get into going ahead to record the podcast episode. I've got a few of these live talks backed up, have not edited into the podcast yet, so soon we will have a stream of, God willing, daily or regular episodes of the Jew Curious show based on these live studio recordings. If this is your first time playing and you have endured the first several minutes of this video, regardless of technical mishaps, what we're doing today is we're doing a live studio recording of the Jew Curious show, which is a podcast that I put together, and we've got about 33 or so episodes so far. It's been great conversations with guests that I have and me sharing some of my thoughts as well. Lately, it's been more talks that we have live here on YouTube Live, where I'll bring something to teach and then take people's questions live. Or sometimes I just do an AMA, like an Ask Me Anything, and people weigh into those conversations, because I fully believe the best that I can do as a teacher is to answer the real questions of my audience. Like, I have some things I want to share that I hope people should know, but what I really want to do is to get into the questions that real people have, and when real people ask their questions, then more real people get answers to the questions that they have. So please don't be shy about asking questions today, because not only are you helping yourself out, you're helping other people out as well. So let's go ahead and do an intro to the podcast episode. So this is going to sound a little radio voicey from me. Just a second, clearing the pipes. Red leather, yellow leather, unique New York. Take a little sip of fuel there. And away we go. Hero, have you ever wondered why sometimes bad things happen to good people? Of course you have. You may have even wondered why sometimes good things happen to bad people. You are not alone. And in today's show, we are going to discuss some Jewish points of view on this very puzzling topic right after this bass. Take a little silent sample here for the after editing. All right, that silence sounds good. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey Weissenberg and Hadar Ensemble for those inspiring opening beats. Thank you to our live studio audience today, which consists of people from around the world. We've got Suzanne is here from Northern California. Karen is here from Toronto. Daniel's here from Fort Worth, Texas, home of the Fort Worth Stockyards. We've got, let's see, Milo is here from Denmark. Ruthie is here from SoCal. I'm also here from SoCal. Jessica, welcome. Happy to have you back. And I'm excited because my microphone is now working. This, as I said, was a live studio recording. And sometimes in live, stuff goes wrong. The microphones don't work right until they do, and then we jump right into the topic at hand. And if I haven't thanked you yet, hero, I mean to do so right now. I am super grateful that you've joined us for this episode of the Jew Curious School. I firmly believe that every religious tradition has to face up to two fundamental human questions. There are probably other questions as well, but these, in my experience, are the hardest ones to answer that religious traditions and spiritual traditions attempt to help people work through. And those two questions are, why do bad things happen to good people? And what happens to us after we die? Today, we are talking about the former question, why do bad things happen to good people? In the next episode, we'll be discussing the latter question, the ultimate question, if you will, what happens after we die? And I will share in the next episode some Jewish perspectives, plural, on that. Before we get too deep into it, I want to give before we get too deep into it, I want to recognize some people who have joined us along the way. Miriam here just got home, joining us from New Hampshire. And Lisa Merdinger is here saying hi from Chicago. Welcome, everybody. And I see Val as well from Naples, Florida. So we are coast to coast and worldwide today. I'll take it. One more thing before we get started on the topic. One more thing before we get started on the topic. If you are new to the Jew Curious show and you haven't done so yet, I highly encourage you to subscribe to this podcast. Your podcast listening device will have some little button or a picture of a button that you can tap, and when you do, you will henceforth automatically download every single episode that we do, and you will have perfect and eternal access, well, as long as, internet exists, to prior episodes of this podcast. And you don't really have to work too hard to get that stuff. It's like a magical internet butler brings them to you on a tray. All you have to do is hit that subscribe button. And then put the phone in your pocket, put it out of reach on your dashboard, settle in for this great conversation that we are about to have on the topic of why do bad things happen to good people? In theology circles, this has a technical name. This question is called theodicy, or the problem of evil. And this problem, let's see, before I get into the problem, let's address the question. The question that people ask, they look around in the world and they say, I see people who seem to be good people, and they are suffering. And I also see people who seem to be not so nice people, and they seem to be prospering. And I think for most human beings, I'm not going to limit it to Jews this time, for most human beings, this seems profoundly unfair. It goes contrary to our innate sense of justice. And I personally am a big fan of the work of John Rawls, the philosopher who equates justice in society with fairness. We perceive that a society is just insofar as it seems fair. People who play by the rules get consequences doled out according to the rules. Good people get good consequences. Bad people, quote unquote, get bad consequences. Or good acts engender good consequences. Bad acts engender bad consequences. And anytime we see this subverted in our own observations of the world, this seems profoundly unfair, so much so that people question the existence of God. The question they ask themselves is, how can a God who is presumably everywhere, all powerful, all good, all loving, and all just. My teacher, Rabbi Artson, calls this the God of the omnis, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, omnijust. I don't know if that's a word. Omniscient. Let me do this again. A God. This God of the omnis is a God who is omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, is all loving, is all just. How can a God like this allow unjust behavior, unjust consequences in the world? And that really pushes people toward doubt. We have situations like, and I'm just going to quote the two that are hardest for me to get my head around. One is the Shoah, the Holocaust, right? People ask, how could something like that happen if a God exists, period, right? All the more so, how could it happen to what we often talk of as God's chosen people? How could this happen in a universe governed by justice and a God governed by love? The harder one for me, I'll say personally, I can't speak for anybody else, is, let's say, pediatric chronic illness. When a child is suffering from an illness that they had no part in creating. Sometimes people say, well, if somebody has an illness later in life, well, maybe they didn't take care of themselves. Maybe it was some vices that they had, that they brought that kind of sickness on themselves. They did a kind of work that exposed them to toxins. There was some human hand in that consequence. But a little child that has nothing like this kind of responsibility, how could that happen? And this has been going on since the dawn of human perception, where people see things that seem out of order in the world. We assume a certain kind of justice. We assume a certain kind of love from a beneficent creator. And anytime we see this kind of unfairness, it challenges that sense of justice. And this is why we call it the problem of evil. How can evil exist in the world? Or how can any subversion of justice exist in a God that is all-loving, all-powerful, all-present, all-knowing, and all-just? And I want to share with you a particular teaching from the Jewish tradition, and then I will share with you perhaps an opposite teaching from the Jewish tradition, two different perspectives by which to approach this very difficult topic. The first one comes from the first lesson comes from Masechet Brachot. It's a page in the Talmud, right in the first chapter of the first volume of the Talmud, and it talks about Yisarin Shel Ahava. And I'll get to what that means in just a second. It first poses the scenario: if you find that Yisarin are upon you. Yisarin means pains, but not just like aches and pains, boo-boos, stubbing your toe. This is talking about things like cancer, like a chronic illness, chronic pain, a terminal illness, which they may not have had the same vocabulary that we do back in the time of the Talmud. But if these kinds of sufferings are falling upon you, also included in this kind of suffering is what I take to be the ultimate measure of suffering that a human can experience, that is the death of a child. When these kinds of things happen, the Talmud says, the rabbis on this particular page say, you should examine your deeds, meaning if you are suffering, our sense of justice presumes that it might be something you did to cause that suffering. So were you a bad person, or did you act badly? Did you fail to tithe appropriately? Did you fail to help out poor people? Did you fail to make amends for something that you got wrong? Right? Were you unkind? Did you break a commandment? Right? Because people at that time believed that suffering was a direct judgment from God. This is well before germ theory and things like that. And so they thought, if you're suffering, maybe it was because of something else that you did, and this is God's judgment upon you. And I should probably put an asterisk on this segment. We're going to talk about some things that might make people pretty uncomfortable. For some people, this idea that suffering in this world has a metaphysical connection to sin and absolution and things like that. Some people are very comfortable with that idea. Some people are intensely uncomfortable with that idea. And so if I'm making you uncomfortable, I apologize a little bit, but this is an uncomfortable subject, so just be prepared. I promise you we will come back to a different perspective. So if this kind of suffering falls upon you, examine your deeds. It might be because of something you did. This was the same thing that Job's friends said to Job in the eponymous book of Job when he lost his family, he lost his livelihood, he lost his health. His friends came to visit him and they said, "Are you sure you didn't do something wrong? Like, has any man ever suffered so who was wholly righteous?" Later on in the Talmud, I'll say that it gives advice on speech ethics. It gives advice on speech ethics and warns us: if your friend is suffering, never talk to him or her like Job's friends talked to Job. So, just wanted to throw that out there. If you have examined your deeds, we'll go back to Masechet Brachot 5a. If you have examined your deeds and you find them, unwanting, meaning I'm a perfect citizen. I do all the mitzvahs. I give to charity. I'm kind to strangers. I don't kick puppies, God forbid. My deeds are flawless. And yet you are still suffering. Then you should probably attribute your suffering to a deficiency in Torah study. Meaning, if you act right in the world but you're still suffering, maybe that's God's signal that you should be studying Torah more. Not for nothing, this was written by rabbis who are super into Torah study, by the way. If you find that your Torah study is sufficient and your deeds are sufficient, then you can presume that this suffering that has befallen you is what we call Yisurin Shel Ahava. These are the sufferings of divine love. And they explain this by way of connecting it to Olam Haba. And we've talked about Olam Haba a little bit on this podcast before, this notion of a world to come in the sort of post-Messianic era. All the dead are returned to the land of the living. Everybody lives in this kind of peaceful paradise, and everybody has a share in the world to come that is proportionate to how they lived in this world, right? And just to put this up front, everybody gets a share. Like, everybody's there, except some people have a slightly nicer slice of paradise than other people, depending on how you lived your life in this world. And by this calculus of Yisurin Shel Ahava, these sufferings of divine love, the rabbis decided that if you are suffering in this world in a way that seems disproportionate to your deeds, then this is God expressing love for you by giving you more than you can bear in this world so that you can have an even greater share in the world to come. And so Judaism in this moment shares with other traditions the redemptive power of suffering, right? We suffer in this world so that we can have an even greater paradise in the next world. This is something that was native to Jewish conversations circa 500 of the Common Era, and was probably a long existent oral tradition before that. I was sharing this teaching with a synagogue here in Southern California where I teach sometimes, and immediately afterwards I asked them the question, how do you feel about that? And I'll ask this question now to the people in the live studio audience. How do you feel about that? Right? Some people are very comfortable with this idea. Some people are not. And I will share that one of the times that I taught this, based on some other learning that I had done, when I was first learning this passage, they said, you should try, but let me take this back. And I will share with you that at one point I was learning this passage of Talmud with a friend of mine who was suffering from terminal inoperable brain cancer. And he and I had agreed to get together about once a week or every 2 weeks, something like that, and do a little Torah study. And he said, look, I'm not a religious guy. I don't believe in all this God and heaven and hell business, but I like hanging out with you, Rabbi. And I know for you to feel like a rabbi, you got to probably bring some Torah study. So we'll just shoot the breeze, talk about the Dodgers, and you can teach me a little bit of Torah if you want to. And so I brought my Masechet Brachot, and I brought this passage, and I said, what do you think of this? These guys are saying, if you are suffering in this world, A, it's probably something you did. If you don't believe it's something you did, then maybe it's because you don't study enough Torah. And if you're not convinced by that, maybe it's because God just loves you so darn much. And this gentleman, I failed to mention, he was in his 50s at the time. He had a long life ahead of him until he didn't. What he said to me was, Rabbi, I thought we were friends. Why the heck would you bring this to me? I mean, this just seems mean and cruel and capricious and proof positive that I've been right about religion this whole time. And so I said to him, wait, it gets better. Let's turn the page. And so before we turn the page on Masechet Brachot 5a to Masechet Brachot 5b, I'm going to take a little minute to see what people are saying in the chat about this difficult topic. Listen, I really appreciate people hanging out and weighing in on this. Karen says, could bad things happen, Rabbi, for us to learn to turn to Hashem for help? If all is good in life, we can become proud and not learn and not lean on God. Maybe suffering is a test for us so that we can prove that we will do mitzvot and good deeds despite what goes wrong. Perhaps that's also a very Jewish view. I will not argue with that. Perhaps, more Torah study is always a good thing. It's not lost, right? There's another tradition from earlier in Masechet Brachot. There's no such thing as wasted time studying Torah. All learning is beneficial. Ruthie shares, I don't know if one of my children became terminally ill, if I could see it that way, right? Maybe this is happening for a reason. And I'll say, I work with families. I have, let's say, I won't say the pleasure, but the honor of being present with families when they are going through tough times. And one thing I never say is everything happens for a reason. I know people who live by this philosophy and get great comfort from this philosophy, but that's not how I would talk to people in a time of suffering. Drake shares, for me personally, I don't feel that these answers are satisfying. That's not to say that they're necessarily untrue, but they aren't satisfying on an emotional or rational level. Listen, we're going right back to the basics. I think that most of human metaphysics and the discussions therein, that is understanding how the universe operates beyond our field of vision, beyond our ability to perceive and weigh and measure, are to square reality or ultimate reality with our perceptions, right? We think that the universe is just, and yet we perceive injustice all the time. And we can't rationally understand, and that's why many religions come in and say, well, this is happening at a level maybe beyond your understanding, or it's happening for reasons that maybe you don't appreciate now. And some people draw faith from that, and some people don't. Val shares, I live with more than one rare genetic disorder. Honestly, I just drew the winning genetic lottery ticket, quote unquote. I don't believe I'm going to gain something. I did become, she says, far more empathetic and learn to appreciate life that much more. It makes you realize how short time is. This morning I had the privilege of sitting in and listening in on a conversation between two rabbis about how their experience of having cancer in childhood shaped them into the rabbis that they would become, on how it made them see the world differently, on how it made them approach other people in a pastoral way differently. Karen shares, if we were spirits before we came here to be born, maybe we were told that what our life would be like and agreed to what our challenges would be here. That's something I think very few of us have a direct memory from, right? But there's a Jewish teaching. If you ever, and you can see this in the video, you can't see this in the podcast, but I'll describe it. Take your finger, put it on the tip of your nose, and then move your finger down to the edge of your lip, and there's that little divot right there. Most people have that little divot under their nose, directly in the middle of their lip. This is called medically the frenulum. And there's a Jewish teaching that that particular spot is where, right before you're born, and you're fully aware of the life that your soul had before it entered your new body, and you have perfect knowledge, perfect understanding of the workings of heaven, and then right before you're born, an angel touches you right there above your lips and says, shh, and we forget anything that our soul might have known before so that we can experience the world anew. That's why we have a frenulum. But that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is Jewish ideas, plural, about the role of suffering in this world and how we might respond to it, how we might understand it. And a second ago, we turned the page. We're now on Masechet Brachot 5b. It might still be part of 5a, gliding over into 5b. And there's a story about some rabbis. So, it's a Talmud. What are you going to do? It's got a lot of stories about rabbis in it. And there's a story about a particular rabbi who was named Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan had several superpowers, right? He was like the Deadpool of rabbis. He had all these different superpowers blended into one being, one of which it was said that he was super handsome. He was the handsomest rabbi and perhaps the handsomest human being that ever was. Everybody loved Rabbi Yochanan. And it said that he was so handsome that he would sit outside the mikveh when women were going to bathe and prepare themselves for relations with their husbands. And Rabbi Yochanan was so handsome, he would sit outside the mikveh, and just by looking at him, the women would go home and have beautiful children that looked just like him. Maybe that's how it happened. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But I'm gonna give Rabbi Yochanan the benefit of the doubt on this one. He was also a super healer. He could reach out, grab somebody's hand, and cure them of any illness that befell them. One more thing, kind of a neat trick, he had a glowing arm. Like if he rolled up his sleeve in a dark room, his arm would illuminate the entire room. And his fourth superpower, I don't know if you'd want to call it this, not to his face, he had supernatural suffering in his life. It's said that Rabbi Yochanan, in his lifetime, buried 10 of his own children, and that he even carried a bone of one of his children tucked into his turban as a memento of the family he had and then lost. And so this guy knew suffering more than most human beings get to know suffering. But one day, a friend of his has fallen ill. And he goes to see his friend. His friend is lying on the bed. Another rabbi. We rabbis hang out a lot. And he says to his friend, "Friend, is your suffering so dear to you?" And what he was asking was the question that was raised on the previous page. He's asking this to a scholar. Right? He's asking his friend, your suffering right now, is it dear to you because you desire to store up a greater share in the world to come? And his friend said, neither the suffering nor its reward. And so Rabbi Yochanan said, give me your hand. And he grabbed his hand and he lifted his friend up wholly healed. And so even though the rabbis had this tradition where we suffer in this world as is our due, and if we are suffering beyond our due, it's because God loves us so much, and we should accept that as a gift. But in the moment, this scholar said, sometimes suffering just sucks, and you can have it. I'd rather be healed. Thank you very much. A few days later, we hear that Rabbi Yochanan has fallen ill. Rabbi Yochanan, the super healer, has fallen ill. And another friend of his comes over and says, Rabbi Yochanan, is your suffering dear to you? And Rabbi Yochanan says, neither my suffering nor its reward. And his friend reaches out, grabs Rabbi Yochanan by the hand, and picks him up, fully healed. And this raises a big fuss among the rabbis who heard this story. They go back to the study hall. They say, hey, wait a minute. Mr. Healy Pants over here couldn't heal himself? What's with that? To which a smart, or maybe just smart aleck, rabbi in the back of the room says, you know, a prisoner can't release himself from jail. What he meant by that was even healers need healing. Even healers need the presence of other people to restore themselves to health, which is another teaching altogether on why we should look out for people, even if those people are the ones we trust to look out for us. And if we are the people who look out for others, we should be fully willing to accept help. Right? Sometimes they say doctors are the worst patients, and maybe that was true for Rabbi Yochanan, but his friend helped him out of that difficult situation, and we need to recognize that. So as every good story, this has a third part to it. I don't know if it's a good story. You be the judge of that. I like it. It's one of my favorite stories. So Rabbi Yochanan goes to see another friend, and his friend is sick, and he's lying in a dark room. Not only is he sick, he's lying in a dark room, pitch black, but Rabbi Yochanan can hear him crying. And so what does Rabbi Yochanan do? He rolls up his sleeve, and his magic glowing arm illuminates the room, and he sees that his sick friend, is there sobbing. And he says to his friend, what are you crying about? Is it because you're not rich? Not everybody gets a double portion in life. Are you crying because you didn't study enough Torah and you think you're sick because of that? Hey, we have a teaching, one who does a lot and one who does a little. Their reward is the same, provided their heart is directed toward heaven. This is a teaching that we had in the Jew Curious School talking about the first chapter of Leviticus. Whether you bring a bull or a bird or a pile of wheat, the reward, or rather the pleasure that God gets out of it, is the same if your intention is the same. So he said, don't cry because you're not rich. Not everybody gets to be. Don't cry because you don't study enough. It's the thought that counts. He says, are you crying because you didn't have a big family? And then he pulls that bone out of his turban. And he says, this is the bone of my 10th son. You don't get to compare your suffering to mine. I mean, I think the real lesson there is that when you're visiting somebody, sometimes the last thing you want to do is explain their suffering. Right? Sometimes the last thing you want to do is like, hey, not everybody gets to be rich. I know you're crying about being hungry. You know, not people offer these explanations. Everything happens for a reason. Your loved one is with God now in paradise. Things like this. When my rabbi, Aaron Alexander, taught me, when someone is suffering, the best thing you can say to them is, I'm sorry, and nothing after that. Just be present with them. But his friend eventually speaks and says, Rabbi Yochanan, I'm crying because I know that in this world, even beauty such as yours will crumble into the dust. That we are all mortal. We all go through suffering in our own measure, and our end is the same. And that seems profoundly unfair. And Rabbi Yochanan says to him, this is a good reason to cry. and he sits down next to him on the floor and starts crying. And these two friends are crying together. And eventually, they wipe their noses, they wash their faces, and Rabbi Yochanan says, "Is your suffering dear to you?" And his friend says, "Neither it nor its reward." And Rabbi Yochanan reaches out his hand and heals him. These two meditations on suffering in the world are written on the same, I'll say, sheet of paper on either side of the same page in the Talmud, which teaches us that there's not one way to explain why bad things happen to good people, why good things happen to bad people, and how we are to justify it with our own sense of justice and fairness in the world. On the one hand, there's a kind of metaphysical calculus that puts us in our place. If something happens bad, it's probably because you deserve it. And if you don't deserve it, it's because God loves you so much. And for some people, this is profoundly comforting. For some people, this is why they leave religious communities altogether, because it is so inconsonant with our sense of rationality and with our sense of having a loving God in the first place. And then there are those rabbis who say, suffering is just suffering. The best thing that we can do is be there for each other when it happens, and to let other people be there for us when it happens. And for some people, this feels so totally disconnected from God that they wonder, how can somebody endure? What are we to believe about the world to come? And yet, for some people, this is a much more effective way to think about suffering. As some have suggested here, perhaps it's a positive way to learn to be grateful for the second chance on the other side, perhaps, to be more empathetic towards others. However, I don't think all suffering is intended to teach us a lesson, but can we learn a lesson and improve our lives and the lives of others? Absolutely. And I want to wrap up this segment before I go back into the questions with a teaching about God that helped me personally reconnect with God. And that was a teaching of Rabbi Ed Feinstein, himself a survivor of cancer and no stranger to suffering, and now one of, I'll say, the best living rabbis that I know. And so he has the occasion to be with other families in times of suffering. And he says to us, especially when it comes to health stuff, and like I said before, my two greatest, let's say, conundra in the problem of evil are events like the Shoah, although I can understand the Shoah not as a judgment from God or a failure of God, God forbid, but as a massive failure in the use of the free will that God gave us until we decided to fix that problem as best we could. The hard thing is when people fall ill and somehow attributing this to a kind of justice in the world for our deeds. And what Rabbi Feinstein teaches is this. You know, our souls are a gift from heaven. They are made of eternal stuff. But our body is just made of stuff. It's the stuff of the earth. And stuff breaks. Right? You are given a human body made out of atoms and molecules and observing physical properties and suffering from the randomness of quantum physics, where sometimes genes mutate. Right? Sometimes systems don't work the way they're supposed to. Your parts wear out faster than the car. And when that happens, our bodies fail us. And this is the twin gift that we get the day that we're born, an eternal soul and a very temporary body. And when that stuff breaks, we don't have to blame God or credit God, who, by the way, also gave us the soul and the body as a vehicle for doing mitzvot in the world. But on the day that Abraham was sitting in the outside of his tent in the heat of the day by the terebinths of Mamre, recovering from surgery, God visited him as a way of Bikur Cholim, as this mitzvah of visiting the sick. God sits with us when we are suffering, and God teaches us to sit with each other. And fundamentally, what I took from Rabbi Feinstein is that God is not in the business of making us suffer, of going around causing suffering based on some kind of sense of justice. God is in the business of suffering with us and teaching us how to suffer with each other. God is not in the business of making us cry. God is in the business of crying with us and teaching us to cry with one another. And so I'll say there are two, at least, legitimate Jewish views on why bad things happen to good people. Some people are very satisfied with the answer that everything works out in the end, all the accounts are balanced, that suffering in this world happens either because you're asking for it or because you have a greater eternal reward. And there are those who say that suffering is just suffering. It's the physical world it's the physical world and the free will that God gave us. And sometimes it doesn't work out. But we have a tradition that teaches us to be there for people when they need us and let other people be there for us when we need it. And I'll say of the two, I find that the most satisfying. So I want to I want to give this a rest for a little bit. Sorry for the preach. But I want to go into the chat to see what people are sharing. Daniel shares, man, I need that rabbi's abilities, lol. So yes, we would all like to be superheroes in some fashion. I think if I have a superpower, it's being late for everything. I'm sorry about that. As my friend Ashby says, it's the worst superpower ever. Miriam sharing, what about the Shoah? Definitely evil people getting away with killing innocent people, especially children, and innocent people suffering from unimaginable evil. And I can't disagree with a single thing you've said there. Yes, it was people bent on doing evil, getting away with evil stuff, and innocent people suffering. This is the most massively negative outcome I can imagine from the gift of free will that God gave us. The wisdom to think that human beings use the God-given ingenuity to engineer murder on a massive scale because they were afraid for their own power. They were afraid on behalf of their people, and so scapegoated our people. And it's disgusting. But I think at least as disgusting is the assertion that some religious people make, some rabbis make, that this was a judgment on us, that somehow Jews caused that kind of suffering in some metaphysical way, and that I can't cotton to. I'll say another meditation on this seeming paradox of an omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent, and all-loving God allowing something like this to happen is questioning the assumptions of our omnis. And a much more articulate teacher on this than I is Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson. I think I mentioned him earlier, who through scholarly work has gone back to demonstrate that this notion of a God of the omnis is a profoundly Greek idea invented by Aristotle to make the math of his physics work. And so when Aristotle was coming up for a model of the universe, he said, in order for this God thing to be real, it has to be omnipresent, omnipowerful, omnibenevolent, and, infinite in all directions. And this is something that came into the world's thinking several hundred, if not 1,000 or more years after Torah. Right? This is sort of concurrent with the Babylonian exile. We'd already lived a full life as a civilization when this thing came on the scene. And if you look at the texts of the Tanakh, there's a lot of assertions about God's power and God's love and God's sense of justice, but the word omni isn't used once. Not just because it's, that's a Greek word, but this idea that a God is all of these things, which essentially erases God as a kind of metaphysical paradox that makes injustice impossible. So when we invent a God that is all everything, we then are stuck with a world that doesn't seem to measure up to that God. And I will say that many theories of the afterlife are based on this notion of squaring accounts, in the sense of, if God is ultimately just and the world as we experience it is not, there must be another world where the balances are paid. And I think that's one notion of heaven and hell and where those things come from. That if you suffer more than you deserve in this world, you get a great share in the world to come. If you benefit more in this world, then you get some sort of punishment on the other side, because that's what satisfies our sense of fairness and justice and allows us to get through our day without cracking up, frankly. So I don't knock that theory in the sense that it's very helpful to some people. And we'll talk about Jewish views of the afterlife in the next episode related to that and totally unrelated to that. And so just wanted to kind of share that with you. If you wanted to learn more about this, I think it's Jew Curious Show episode number 3 or 4 or 5. I talked to Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson about this and about his book on the subject, about process theology, the God of becoming and relationship. Gives a much better explanation than I could. So with that, I've had some great questions today. I'm just going to see what else we have. Let's see. I see Trig has joined us in the chat, says she's sorry she missed it, but it'll be in the replay as soon as this video is over with. Bud Rod from Georgia says hello. Hey, Bud Rod, good to see you there, buddy. Kathy is here. And now I just see people giving each other high fives and hugs in the chat. This is my favorite thing about the learning that we do together, is not the learning per se, although I have enjoyed it immensely, but the community that we are building together. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and begin to end this program. Really grateful. We made Minyan and then some today. So thank you to the live studio audience. And thank you, Hero, for tuning in once more to the Jew Curious Show podcast. If you're here for the first time, I hope you got something out of it and you come back for the second time. Another way that you can connect with this community is by joining the Jew Curious Community Center to experience a carefully tended, carefully guarded, troll-free private community of Jew curious people just like you. Go to jewcurious.show/JCC, as in Jew Curious Community Center. Enter your email address and you will get instructions on how to join this club. We got jackets. Now we don't have jackets yet. You guys like jackets? Maybe we'll make some jackets. I think that'd be dope. Although I live in Southern California, which is mostly a jacket-free zone once April starts. Just a couple more things I want to share. I would also like to share that this podcast is made possible by the Jew Curious School. This is a school that we've had running since 2018 of the Common Era. We've been going for a few months now, and in the Jew Curious School, we have several students who every week get to experience 3 live sessions like this one, only in sort of a smaller, more intimate, slightly more interactive group. We've got the Torah portion of the week. We've got a class on the Torah portion of the week. We've got a class on a relevant subject for the time. Right now we're talking about Passover, because it's coming, y'all. And we even have a complete introduction to Judaism class. But that's not even my favorite thing but as much as I love teaching that class, it is not even my favorite thing. My favorite thing about the Jew Curious School is the community of Jew curious people just like you who have come together to learn, but also have come together just to gossip, just to chat, just to hang out with each other, to support each other in time of need, to give each other high fives in times of growth. And that has been the greatest surprise for me to see that develop, but also the greatest blessing of this community that we're building together. So if you'd like to check that out, go to jewcurious.show/ info, and you will be able to find out more about that, hear about other people's experience, see what it looks like on the inside, and consider giving it a try. We have a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you decide it's not for you within the first 30 days, full refund, no judgments, no hassles. And before we go, just let me say one more time, thank you to our wonderful live studio audience. Thank you, Hero, for listening to this show and learning with us today. Until next time, Hero, peace. All right, everybody. Thank you for coming in. Kathy's saying, please help with our Passover picnic in a future podcast. I love this idea, Passover picnic. I don't know if this is a real thing you've got planned, but I think it's a fantastic idea. Where else are you going to recline except in the grass? Although you might want to do that in the daytime. I don't know if night picnics are a thing. Although that sounds kind of entertaining. I think that's just called camping. So, really, everybody, thank you for being here today. Thank you for showing up and for hanging on through some technical difficulties. Been experimenting a little bit with my live streaming software to make it an even better experience for you gradually. So, sorry it didn't work out when we first started, but really happy that people decided to hang out with me, to hang out with each other, and to do this learning. Again, this is my favorite thing to teach. Teaching is my favorite thing to do after hanging out with my family. And this particular teaching that I shared today is one of the ones that means the most to me. I should probably splice this in later, that I'll say once we turn the page, once we learned this alternative view of suffering, my late friend Peter and I were still friends. And I dedicate this learning today in his memory, a man who suffered certainly more than his due, but also contributed to his community, his family, and his friends more than we had the right to expect. We have a Passover. Oh, you said Passover. So sorry about that. So you said Passover panic. I think you said Passover picnic. But now you've given me ideas for a Passover picnic. So thank you for that. Cass, Ruthie, Karen, everybody, thank you for joining us today. Val, Fernando, thanks for being here, man. Trig, nice to see you here, Trig. Edith Castro, thank you for coming in from New York. And we got some smileys, we got some hearts, and really appreciate everybody's learning here with me today. For now, I'm going to sign off and say until next time, heroes, peace.